Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Captain Andrew Marcial, class of '89, and honored to serve as the president of the Alumni Association and to help moderate this session today. So we're expecting quite a few folks. It looks like almost half are there, but we're going to forge ahead because we have a lot of good ground and conversation to have. So thanks for joining us on this virtual session as part of a series of engagements in response to Operation Fouled Anchor, which many of you know was a report of years-long investigation into the mishandling of sexual assault and harassment cases at the Academy from 1988 to 2006. So your Alumni Association is committed to supporting those directly and indirectly impacted by this in any way we can, continuing to keep our community informed, as well as pursuing changes to help enhance prevention and response programs to help eradicate harmful behaviors at the Academy and in the service. So I think this quote from the Commandant really emphasizes what we want to help to pursue. Sanwoo, if you would advance the slide there, to be as transparent as possible, which I think we're all committed to. And having Vice Admiral Thomas and Dr. Navarro here is certainly part of that effort. I'm thrilled to be joined by First Class Alyssa Parker for this session. Alyssa and I spent some time at the NNOA convention, and she showed some insight and perspective into helping lean into this as a future leader of the Coast Guard. So we're thrilled that she could take a break from her busy academic day to do that. So I want to acknowledge that we did receive a few dozen questions in advance, some of which we will be able to address today, many of which we won't be able to, but you have our commitment to diligently work to provide answers to the community and going forward. So with that, let me introduce Vice Admiral Paul Thomas, who currently serves as the Deputy Commandant for Mission Support, and Dr. Michelle Navarro, who's the Executive Director for Personal Readiness, and probably a few other titles that she's carrying on. So since we have a lot of ground to cover, let's dive into the first question. So Admiral Thomas, can you share your thoughts on what Operation Fouled Anchor is and why it was only recently shared with Congress and the public?
Yeah, so Andrea, first of all, let me thank you and the Alumni Association for this opportunity to provide that transparency that the Commandant is so committed to. I'm sure I have a number of classmates and others who I've served with who are listening in today, and I have great respect and concern for them. So I'm really happy for this opportunity. It's a really great question about Fouled Anchor because you're not really going to be able to understand what happened from the CNN reports on a New London day. Now I'm going to hit the high points quickly. And in the course of doing so, maybe answer a lot of the questions that some of you have. In 2014, a woman who had attended the Academy approached the VA to get some help recovering from a sexual assault with sexual trauma that occurred to her only almost 20 years later. And the VA essentially said to her, there's no record of this assault, so we can't provide you the care that you need. And so she went to the Academy Sexual Assault Response Coordinator and made a report in 2014 of an assault that occurred. She was the victim nearly 20 years later or earlier. When that report was made, CGIS, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, stood up an investigation, a criminal investigation, to go back and see what they could learn. In the course of that investigation, kind of two things happened. One, CGIS discovered that there were a number of cases that were mishandled back in the 88 to 2006 timeframe, and I'll talk about that timeframe here in a minute. And that led to opening of additional investigations and then the birth of Operation Fouled Anchor. So Fouled Anchor is not an investigation itself, it's a series of investigations. And it also, in the course of those investigations, led to identifying additional victims, because one victim would say, hey, I know this happened to this person, you might want to speak with them. And so Fouled Anchor involved dozens of agents, thousands of hours of investigations, thousands of documents and witness testimonies. And at the end, a couple dozen, 3 dozen or so victims who wanted the previous assaults to be thoroughly investigated by CGIS. Now, a little bit about the timeline. In the course of investigating the first reported investigation, it became apparent that the powers that be back in the 80s did not refer every criminal charge or allegation for criminal investigations. It wasn't until about 2002 that we had a service-wide requirement that they all get investigated by CJIS. And so the 2006 end date is based on, all right, in 2002, we told commanders they must report to CJIS. By 2006, we're confident that they did. The 1988, date is because that's about when the people who were in the center of this investigation, that's about that was their knowledge of people, right? They didn't really know anybody prior to 88. It is definitely not an indication that we don't think sexual assaults occurred before 1988 or sexual harassment. And in fact, we have investigated a number of those assaults, just not as part of fouled anchor. And we today continue to investigate assaults that we get reported to us. So at the end of the day, when CJIS completed their investigations, whether or not particularly in those cases where the assault could be substantiated, every single victim was individually met with and counseled, explained to them the results of the investigation and also what resources were available to them to help them with their recovery. At the end of the day, there were very few perpetrators who still remained within the Coast Guard's jurisdiction. And in those cases, they were held accountable through administrative means. In 2 cases, 2 officers retired as a result of those administrative means. In a couple other cases, the perpetrators were in other services and the evidence was transferred to those services. In one case, the Air Force actually prosecuted in a court-martial. Unfortunately, that conviction was overturned because of statutory limitations. And then in most other cases where the charges were substantiated, the member was no longer within the Coast Guard jurisdiction. Just a couple real things that are important to understand. Court-martialing these offenders was not an option for us because the statute of limitations at the time that the crime had occurred was 5 years. We have since worked with Congress and the other services to extend that out, but that was not an option. The second thing is I often get asked, hey, why were these officers allowed to retire? The fact of the matter is that by law, you can only take an officer's retirement through a conviction by court-martial. And so our only options were administrative actions that would essentially end their career and give them no choice but to retire. And we did that as part of fouled anchor. There's 2 cases that you probably have read about, but we've done that in other cases as well, and as recently as last week. With regards to accountability for the Academy leadership during the time, and there's no question that there's evidence that they mishandled these cases, particularly criminal charges that were not criminally investigated. All of those, superintendents and assistant soups and commandant cadets, all of them have obviously retired from the service by the time we did fouled anchor. Some of them were deceased. Really was no mechanism for us to go back and hold them accountable. And then the final point that I'll make with fouled anchor, and I know there's so many other questions that you could have, but at the end of the day, as I said, what the Coast Guard did, if you read CNN, you will get the impression that fouled anchor is about the Coast Guard ignoring charges of a sexual assault. That is not what it is about. That occurred in the 80s and 90s when the assaults occurred, and that was absolutely wrong. Fouled anchor was the Coast Guard's attempt to go back and do what we could to make that right. Where the Coast Guard failed, you, our alumni, and all of our stakeholders, is that once the operation was concluded, during the course of operation, everything was close hold as it should be because of open investigations and protecting victims. But once the operation was concluded, the Coast Guard did not come out and say, here's what we did, like I just told you, here's what we found, here are their numbers. And that is what the CNN story is about. And the Commandant has owned that, and I own it as well. I was not involved in those decisions, but we should have communicated with our stakeholders what fouled anchor was and what we discovered. So hopefully, Andrea, I know that's a lot quick, but hopefully that gives our alumni a better sense for what happened.
Yeah, thanks, Admiral. Appreciate that. Alyssa?
Dr. Navarro, I think we all recognize that these incidents are not isolated to the Academy. Can you share some data on incidents in the service?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the data with you. I'm going to talk about a couple different things. First, I'll talk about assaults, and then I'll talk about harassment, which I think is very, very important because it's a continuum of harm that often starts with harassment. So I'll give you data on both of those. The other thing is, in the spirit of trust and transparency, I'll report to you our fiscal year 20 numbers. And also I'll tell you about our fiscal year 21 numbers. That report is not yet released to Congress. So you're being given this information ahead of time. So I just want to mention that because we do want to be transparent with you and answer your questions. So I'll start by who tracks these cases that we end up with the numbers that are in the congressional report. The SAPR office, those are restricted reports, meaning that anyone can go to the SAPR office, you can divulge the information and you can say, I want it restricted, meaning it's not going to go any farther than the SAPR office. The second office that tracks these is the CJIS office, Criminal Investigative Services. They track the information of the victim as well as the accused, and unrestricted reports, meaning that if a victim went forward, they said, you can share this information. That's really important to know. And then the third office is the legal office, right? They're tracking all the accountability of what happened to the proposed perpetrator. So I'll talk about the fiscal year 20 numbers. There were 245 cases across the Coast Guard. In fiscal year 21, and as I said, these aren't released yet, the number was 202. So it went down a little bit. Out of those 202 cases for fiscal year 21, 49 of those were restricted, meaning that I don't want the information going any farther than the SAPR office. Out of the unrestricted, there were 153 reports. 2/3 of that 153 were females, 1/3 were male. And again, I bring that up and I share that detail with you because we need to all recognize and be open to talking with those individuals of the male gender who might have also experienced some of this trauma. So out of those cases, there were an additional 5 that were restricted. So out of the 49 that were restricted, that then the individual said, no, I want to go ahead and I want to make it unrestricted. So that raised that number. And that also enabled us to put that individual into the catch system, which allows us between SAPR, legal, and CJIS to see if there are any repeat or serial offenders. So that was on the assaults. Now I'll talk about the harassment, which, as I said, again, it's a continuum of harm. So it's really important that we pay attention to harassment. This number increased from 88 in fiscal year 20 to 113 in fiscal year 21. That's a 28% increase. Out of those, we conducted 113 investigations. 61 of those 113 investigations were substantiated. Substantiated meaning that, yes, indeed, it was found by evidence that that harassment did occur. And then we look closer at who committed the offense. Out of those cases, the 61, 54 were committed by military members. 5 were committed by civilians and 2 were committed by contractors. And then out of that 113, we also did take a look and see how many of those occurred by cadets. And the number for that is 7. So I just give you a snapshot of some of that data. And again, I remind you that the fiscal year 21 numbers aren't yet released to Congress. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Navarro. I appreciate that information. I'm sure our participants do as well. So Admiral, can you talk a little bit about the main difference in how sexual assault and harassment are handled now compared to how they were handled in Operation Fouled Anchor and that time frame?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Andrea. A lot has changed since you and I were at the academy. I mean, we have, and it's across the services, right? Some driven by Congress, some just driven by our services. But we have done a number of things that I can outline for you that will encourage reporting. Many people know that it was really hard to report back in the 80s and 90s because of the likelihood for retaliation or to be ignored. So encourage reporting, improve support to the victims, both during the response phase when we are potentially prosecuting a case, and then in the longer term recovery. A lot's been done to improve the professionalism of the investigations and the way that we hold people accountable. And most importantly is we've really begun to focus more on prevention and to understand that you in order to stop sexual assault, you have to get to the left of that and a whole continuum of harmful behaviors, including sexual harassment. But with regard to reporting, Michelle mentioned the restricted and unrestricted reporting structures that are in place now. That allows someone to make a report, to get help, but not to be visible to their command, and therefore not go through that scrutiny until they're ready. There's also a provision by which you can make a restricted report and then be ready a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years later. And that often happens now, and say, no, you know what? I want this to go unrestricted because now I want it to be investigated. We've also dealt with what they call collateral misconduct. So often victims would be reluctant to report because they were underage drinking, or they may have been, AWOL, or out of bounds when they shouldn't have been, or in a restricted place. That would prevent them from reporting. So we have a policy in place that says we will not prosecute collateral misconduct for a victim of sexual assault. Now, there's currently a bill on the Hill that would require the Coast Guard to do that. We have already done it. So as soon as that law is passed, we'll be in full compliance with it. And then there's another provision that the services participate in, and the Coast Guard is the #1 service to participate in what's called catch. And that's when a victim says, I've been assaulted. I don't want it investigated right now because I don't want it made public. So I'm going to make a restricted report, but I'm going to put it in this catch database. And if it turns out that that database finds a match, so the person who assaulted me has also assaulted others, then I have the option of saying, you know what, this is a predator. I want to make my restricted report unrestricted, and please investigate this. So reporting is definitely improved. Support to our victims. We have professional sexual assault response coordinators now. We had not had that before. We have a sexual assault prevention and response program office. We have a executive level committee that I chair for service-wide initiatives. We have victims advocates. We have expanded our support to retirees and family members. So if a member's spouse is assaulted, we can provide the support to them. We have special victims counsels that provide legal advice strictly to the victim, not part of the prosecution, not part of the defense. And we have a policy in place that allows members to request a transfer if they've been assaulted or if their spouse has been assaulted. And then with regard to investigations, I mentioned back in the fouled anchor timeframe in the 80s, in the 90s and early 2000s, there was not a prescriptive requirement to commanders to report every sexual assault to a criminal investigation service. There is today. And there is also a requirement to report every sexual harassment to CJIS as a criminal investigation, because sexual harassment is now a criminal offense. We do have a dedicated sex crime program in the Coast Guard with dedicated analysts to help us understand what's happening and where. And just recently, because of a requirement by Congress, we stood up the Office of the Chief Prosecutor, who will prosecute these and other serious crimes outside of the chain of command. And so although the first flag will be the convening officer for court martials, the actual prosecution will happen outside of the chain of command. And the last thing I see, sometimes I get asked about what's called last rank honorably held. There's a provision in the law that said, if I discover that you've committed a violation of our core values, I can make you retire at the last rank honorably held. Back in the day, you can only do that one rank below. We've worked with Congress, and now if we were to determine today that someone committed an offense since that change in the law, we could move them back to, we could move a 05 back to 01, for example. Then finally, I just mentioned prevention. It's a key part of our strategy here. We do have a nascent, what we call integrated prevention program. We have focused on anti-harassment policy. We have an office that just tracks that and ensures we hold people accountable. And we're looking to focus not only on harmful behaviors, but on healthy behaviors. I mean, I could go on, but a lot has changed. I will say that we need to invest more on the prevention side. I think we've got the response investigation well, but we need to get after the prevention side more.
Thank you for that information, Admiral. Dr. Navarro, why do you think this effort and focus by Coast Guard senior leaders to improve the climate and reduce incidents of sexual assault and sexual harassment will be successful?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, a lot of it has to do with what Admiral Thomas just said, right? We're not keeping this a secret. We're trying to be transparent and get this information out. And that is resulting in a couple different things. When we look at the recent data, we see that prevalence is up for sexual harassment and it's on par for sexual assault. And then we look at the reporting, and that is down for sexual assault and up for sexual harassment. I personally think that it's a good thing when the numbers are up for sexual harassment because of that continuum of harm that I talked about, right? If you stop bad behavior when it's at harassment and you call that out as a fail, and then you re-educate that individual that that is not tolerated in the Coast Guard, nor should it be in society, that helps us. So every time we get one of those complaints, that in my mind is a good thing because it allows us to stop that bad behavior. The changes that we are working on and that the Commandant, MICPOG, as well as the other senior leaders, COs, XCOs, they are all trying to demonstrate their commitment to turn the ship around, to not tolerate this kind of behavior. And it's a commitment. It's a commitment to hold people accountable. It's a commitment to help our victims recover, those from the past as well as the current ones, and also an effort to continue to educate and make people aware of unacceptable behavior so that we can stop it early. We need to make changes, and in all fairness, we have. Admiral Thomas outlined some of the changes from 20 years ago to current, but there's still a lot more that we can do, right? We can continue to talk about this very serious issue and make sure that our most vulnerable population know that we support them and that we are here to help them in recovery and to prevent these incidents from happening.
So I would just add on to that. I think that there's a lot of reasons to think that we have gotten better and will continue to get better with regard to response and recovery from sexual assaults. The trick is prevention. And we really need to focus more there. The fact of the matter is the DoD just did a recent study, and more people are entering the service having already experienced sexual trauma in their lives. And the research shows that you're more vulnerable once you've experienced sexual trauma for a repeat. So we need to understand what people coming into our service are bringing with them and then get after that with a prevention program that I mentioned. So this is not something that you win easily or quickly. It will require leaders like you, Alyssa, to keep after it. One of the reasons why I'm hopeful that we will get after it is because we do have leaders like you and others at the Academy coming into our service.
Thank you, Admiral and Doctor. Admiral, could you talk about the goals of the 90-day accountability and transparency review?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the Commandant did commission accountability and transparency review. We call it the ATR. So former weapons officers out there, that's not ammo transaction report. But, you know, I guess it's easiest for me to start with what that is not as a way of managing expectations. So the ATR is not a relook at sexual assault cases that were investigated by the fouled anchor investigators. Again, if additional information comes available that there are additional evidence or additional cases that need to investigate, we will investigate them through our existing processes, which include professional investigators. It is not a look at the accountability of the perpetrators or of the administrators at the Academy during the fouled anchor period, because we've already held them accountable to the fullest extent that we could, as I explained. It is a forward-looking effort to ensure that we hold people accountable better in the future and we're more transparent about it in the future, as well as to ensure that we are doing all that we can do along the prevention and particularly long-term recovery initiatives. You know, if you get the alumni bulletin, mine showed up yesterday, there's a letter in there from the Commandant. And what she talks about is we need to bring our fundamentals of operations that in Pub 1, that's how we operate. We need to bring that to how we are with our people. When you talk to junior coasties, they'll tell you, hey, we talk a lot about dedication to duty because we are all about getting our mission done. And that is absolutely true. And even within the context of getting our mission done, I think we think about that through honor and respect, but we talk about dedication to duty with regard to the workforce much more than we do talk about honor and respect. And we need to bring the same focus on honor and respect to our internal work with our workforce that we do to our external work with our stakeholders. And that's what the Commandant's letter is all about. Getting after ensuring we treat each other with honor and respect and building a culture of respect. So ATR will come back to us with some real recommendations on things that we can do to improve the support to victims, and particularly long-term recovery, and to improve accountability and transparency. But it's going to be an effort well beyond those ATR recommendations to really get after building that culture of respect. So that's what ATR is and what it isn't. So hopefully that will answer your question.
Thank you, Admiral. And I appreciate the reminder about the Commandant's message that is in the bulletin, but it's also on my CG along with a pretty powerful video that it's worth folks taking the time to read that and really get a sense of what that message is from the top. So final question, Dr. Navarro. So what can we do to help? What can alumni and allies do to help the Coast Guard, to help the effort going forward?
So I want to thank the Alumni Association. Many of you are already aware that you have pledged $1 million, which is a very tangible sign of the commitment of the alumni to eradicate this behavior. Aside from that, many of you may know someone that you served with. It may even be yourself that comes to you or comes to another colleague with information about something that happened to them. It could be sexual harassment, it could be sexual assault. What I would ask of you is to listen to them, right? They need to tell their story. They need a non-judgmental individual to help them cope. Each individual deals with tragedy at a different point in time, when they're psychologically ready, when they're in a psychologically safe space. And so if someone comes to you, I would ask you, please listen. Don't judge the situation. We get sometimes reports of individuals that come or call our hotline or reach out to us and they say, well, individuals said to me, well, I shouldn't have been there, or I shouldn't have been drinking. That's blaming the victim. We don't want to do that, right? It's your individual body, and nobody has the right to do with it anything that you don't say is okay. And that goes for men as well as women. So I do just ask you, please listen to them, help them with resources. We have some information provided at the end on who you can contact if you or if someone you know needs to reach out or would like to talk to somebody. As well, there's another thing that you can do. April is Sexual Assault, Sexual Awareness Month. I would encourage you to get involved. We'll be having some different venues going on, both at the Coast Guard Academy. Take Back the Night is one that many of you are familiar with, as well, just across society. So I encourage you to get involved in that way as well.
Thank you. And we really appreciate you making time and the commitment from the Commandant on down to help with what the Alumni Association is sort of leading an effort to provide, education, to provide advocacy when needed, and certainly to bring the community together to both, heal from those incidents of the past and to move forward and recognize that a lot has changed, but there's still work to do. So we really appreciate your time. And as Dr. Navarro shared, there's a slide with some resources on it for anyone who wishes to speak with somebody or who wants additional information about the Coast Guard's anti-harassment program. And that's certainly we'll be able to share that in addition on our website and in our communication. So we've also are embarking on a series of events, both in person and virtually. And our next one is with the Coast Guard Academy's Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, and that's on September 26th. We also pushed out our digital copy of our bulletin, which a lot of the content is focused on this issue, resiliency, mental health, the whole spectrum, about supporting individuals and cadets going forward. So hopefully you'll be able to look at that and see some resources there. And then working with the Coast Guard to to plan an in-person event in Washington, DC in the middle of November, as a way to just create some space to have conversations like we've had today in a more open and transparent manner. Couple things in work. We've engaged with Admiral Lafferty and the Accountability and Transparency Review Team to do some listening sessions, to work on some virtual programming in partnership with the other service academies around survivor support, and then future in-person events, hopefully one out on the West Coast in March with the support of the PAC area team. So we know this is an important conversation. I also acknowledge that many of the questions that were shared in advance and a few of the questions that were shared here today did not get directly answered, but you have our commitment. We're going to collect those, work with the Coast Guard to get those answers and push them out through our channels. So once again, thank you everyone for taking time to join us. Admiral Thomas, Dr. Navarro, Ms. Parker, appreciate it. And hopefully this is a start of a continuing conversation. Have a great day, everyone.
Yep, thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.